Story 1. I live in rural Scotland and something is scratching on my door. So this happened about 3 months back. It stuck with me and I just want to get the whole story off my chest, to be honest. I live in a rural area in the northwest coast of Scotland. The scenery is beautiful, with lochs and bens, lakes and hills for the non-Scots, right outside my door. The nearest village is about a 15-minute drive away and only has a few hundred people itself. Other than that, there are a few other houses sparsely dotted about, but the closest neighbor is still a mile or two away from me. My house is next to the loch, which I'll fish in from time to time, and a large field which acts as my backyard. The field is then abruptly met with a tree line, which is the entrance to one of the largest wooded areas in Scotland. That's more or less the layout of the gaff. Other than that, it's just me living there. My other half passed away a few years ago, and since I fell into a bit of a depression. It was a tough time in my life, but I got through it, especially after I adopted the wee man, Alfie. Alfie's a border terrier and acts as my best pal. He goes everywhere with me, and has really been the difference between life and death at times. Because we're so isolated up here, the usual routine is just before bed, about 9 or 10 p.m., I'll open the back door for Alfie to run round the field for a bit. Get out any last-minute shites or pisses. It's Scotland, so naturally 360 days of the year are freezing. Because of this, I'll shut the door behind him and wait for him to come and scratch the door after to let him in. So this one night, 25th of April this year, things were as normal. I was sat watching some rubbish on Netflix, Alfie next to me. The wee man got up and started stretching, so I made a mental note to go and let him out. I finished watching whatever I was watching and went and opened the back door. The night was, of course, pitch black and I could just see the outline of the trees in the tree line. I lit up a quick cigarette. Bad habit, I know, and smoked it quickly before closing the door. I went and did some bits and bobs, closing curtains and doing some dishes, when I heard Alfie scratching away at the door. It had been about 5 or 10 minutes, so I went to go and let him in again. I put the plate I was cleaning down and began walking down the corridor to the back door. I yawned on the way and gave Alfie a rub on the head as I walked past. I thought about having another cigarette, but I gave Alfie a rub on the head. The thought stopped me dead in my tracks. I turned back and sure enough, Alfie was lying snoozing in the corridor. Weird. I could have sworn I heard him scratching on the door. He must not have gone out when I opened the door, and then I imagined the scratching. I turned around again to head back the way I came, and chills ran down my spine. I heard the scratching again. Now I knew for a fact it wasn't Alfie. He was lying right next to me. I also knew for a fact I hadn't imagined it. I waited a few more seconds and the scratching persisted. I instantly felt my heart drop to my stomach. I felt queasy. What the fuck was scratching at my door? I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom because I knew I could get a view of the back door. And what was at it from that window? I cautiously crept up the stairs and then slowly pulled the curtains back just enough to peek through. I promise on my late Eileen's grave, this next bit is completely true. I watched in horror as a fully grown man who was perched on all fours began to scratch at my back door again. This sight nearly made me faint. I'm not a small man, and I chop and deliver firewood for a living, so I'm pretty strong. But just pure creepiness of seeing this shook me to my core. I couldn't see his face that well, but I could make out he was maybe 30, 40 years old, and was maybe of Western Asian descent, with brown skin and a scraggly black beard. A point that may be relevant is that my particular area of Scotland is very white. About 99%, I think, and everyone knows each other anyway. No one even knows someone of that description in any of the local villages, within 40 or 50 miles. I also could make out a grin on the man's face. It looked like he was trying to stifle it, however, like he was excited but was trying to keep himself composed. The scratch noises were indistinguishable from Alfie's, so I immediately knew he must have had long fingernails. He scratched the door a couple more times over the next minute or so. After this, he crawled down the 3 or 4 stairs back to the back garden and began crawling in circles. This image was even more sickening than the last. A grown man crawling on the floor like a dog. What the actual fuck? That was until he burst out into a sprint. He had quickly risen from his crawl and taken the 10-15 meters he was away as a run-up. A run-up the charge straight into the back door. I fitted those doors myself, so I trusted the hinges they were built on. And rightly so. The man bounced right off the door, but the sound immediately alerted Alfie. Alfie started barking uncontrollably, and I took this as a chance to say something too. "Get the fuck out of here, mate. I can fucking see ya," I shouted down. The man didn't even flinch. He just stood up from the floor and brushed himself off. He didn't even look up at me. He then just turned around and walked calmly further into the backyard, further and further until he hit the tree line, and still kept walking. The guy had only been wearing a hoodie and dark gray tracksuit bottoms, so he must have been freezing. To then venture off into the dark woods, alone, so carelessly? The whole situation had me equally as confused as it did terrified. I called the local village's police station. They said they'd sent someone out to talk to me. When the officer got here, I told him the story and recounted the man to the best of my abilities. But after I finished recounting the tale, all I got was a, "Are you drinking again, Derek?" I couldn't believe it. I had had a wee bit of an issue a few years back after Eileen, but put the booze down and been sober for the last 12 months. He clearly just didn't believe me. Fuck, didn't know if I'd believe me either, to be honest. He left and it was just me and Alfie again. Neither of us slept a wink the rest of the night. I also broke my sobriety for the first time that night, which is not something I'm proud of. And that was that. Didn't hear anything about a body in the woods. Didn't hear anything about a man of that description. Didn't hear anything about the same thing happening to the neighbors. I couldn't believe it. The more I went over it in my head, the more it began to terrify me. That man must have been watching me and noticed my habit of letting Alfie in when he scratched the door, for however many nights before he tried it himself. Was just lucky Alf decided not to go out that night. The part that really terrifies me is that he never knew I was watching him. So when he crawled down and kept his acting like a dog act facade going, that was just for him. He was acting like that thinking no one was watching. I've spent the past months combing over all the pictures of any escaped mental patients or convicts over the last 20 years, but nothing. It's almost as if the guy... Fuck. I hear the fucking scratching again. I hear the fucking scratching at my door again, and Alfie is at my feet. It sounds slower this time, and deeper into the wood of the door. I'm gonna go and confront this bastard. Fuck it. Wish me luck. Story 2. My husband cheated on me. Ever since I found out, he's been acting different. Justin and I had been together for 10 years, married for 6. I'd been with him for my whole adult life. We'd been dating since I was 17 and he was 18. I always thought he was my soulmate, the man I wanted to grow old with. Turns out I was wrong. I was devastated when I found out. Yes, Justin had been staying out later than usual, and his explanations were usually flimsy at best. I'm not stupid. I had my suspicions, but I think I just really didn't want to come to terms with the fact that my husband was seeing another woman. Honestly, I might have gone years without discovering the truth. But Justin got sloppy. "Welcome home, honey. Fun night out with the guys after work again?" "Uh-huh," Justin grumbled, brushing past me. "I made dinner if you're hungry. Beef tips and rice. I know it's one of your favorites." "Ate at the bar. I'm going to bed," he muttered, steadying himself against the wall before woozily clomping up the stairs. My heart sank. Nights like those were becoming more and more frequent. I loved my husband. All I wanted was to spend a little quality time with him after a long day at work. But he couldn't even spare me a few minutes. I glanced up at him as he lumbered up the steps, a tear trickling down my cheek. In an instant, any sadness that I felt was replaced with burning rage. Because when Justin passed underneath the overhead light, I saw what appeared to be a hickey on the side of his neck. A cocktail of emotions swirled within me. Despair, resentment, betrayal. They all hit me like a ton of bricks. I was stunned. I didn't know what to do. I mean, who would? The man I had been head over heels for all that time had stabbed me in the back. I was in disbelief. I stumbled to the kitchen, pulling out a chair before I could collapse. I stared into space, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I sat there for a long time, deep in thought. After a while, I felt numb, like my entire personality had been flushed down the drain, leaving nothing but an empty husk. Then, a thought flashed across my mind. I'd been mistaken. That had to be it. Just a mere trick of the light. It was a pretty dimly lit hallway, after all. Whatever the case, I had to know. I tiptoed upstairs, abandoning my dinner. I crept up to our room as quiet as a church mouse before lightly pushing open the bedroom door. Justin was fast asleep. I didn't waste any time. I rushed across the room, careful to avoid any squeaky floorboards, and I inspected Justin's neck. His snores grew louder as I approached. He always was a heavy sleeper. I cursed when I got a closer look. Justin was sleeping on his side, and I was not going to try to roll him over. I glanced around, searching for anything that might provide concrete evidence. My eyes fell to the bedside table. Bingo. I snatched Justin's phone from his charger. I held my breath as I pressed his meaty thumb onto the screen to unlock it. I grinned, feeling a rush of exhilaration as I achieved my goal. Wah-huh. I froze. Justin groggily opened his eyes a sliver as my hand hovered over him. My blood turned to ice, and I prayed with all my might that my husband would just go back to sleep. To my immense shock, my prayers were answered. Justin mumbled incoherently under his breath before grabbing a fistful of covers and nodding off. I'd escaped by the skin of my teeth. I had to be more careful. The first thing I did was check Justin's texts. I immediately saw a woman's name I didn't recognize. My heart shattered when I read the messages. Hey baby, last night was incredible. See you again after work today? You're damn right. I wish you never had to leave. What about that wife of yours though? Won't she get suspicious? Her, not a chance. Even if she does find out, she won't leave. I could murder a baby in front of her and she'd still think I was a saint. A deep-seated rage bubbled within me. Did Justin really think that little of me? He clearly saw me as nothing more than a spineless, codependent pushover. Well, I'd show him. I screenshotted the evidence, scrolling through dozens of nude photos that I hadn't taken, and sent everything to my number. I deleted any proof of my snooping, then replaced Justin's phone on the charger. I stormed out of the room, grabbing my keys as I went. I made it halfway across the living room when the realization hit me. I had nowhere to go. All my family lived 7 hours away. It was too late to book a decent hotel, and I really didn't want to drag any of my friends into my drama. Not yet, at least. That left me with one option. I had to sleep on the couch. I plopped down onto the sofa and sighed. I didn't want to have to confront it, but I knew what I had to do. In the morning, I was going to find a lawyer and start the divorce process. The thought alone was enough to break me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. I cried like a baby, silently sobbing into a scratchy pillow for what must have been hours. My eyes were puffy by the time I was done. I couldn't fathom falling asleep in a state like that, but I must have at some point, because the next thing I remember, sunlight was flooding through the blinds. "Morning, babe. How'd you—" The rest of the sentence caught in my throat. That was right. Justin and I were about to be over. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, tears stinging at the corners of my vision. I opened up the texts I'd sent myself as proof that the past 12 hours hadn't been some twisted nightmare. But the messages were gone. My eyes grew wide as I stared at the screen. That couldn't be right. They'd been there, clear as day the night before. Something wasn't adding up. I suddenly paused, bolting upright. Was that breakfast? The tantalizing aroma of eggs and bacon wafted around the corner from the kitchen. My brows furrowed. Justin never cooked. My breathing was shallow as I tentatively shuffled toward the kitchen. Curiosity gnawed at me like a piranha. I apprehensively peeked around the corner, unsure of what I would find. To my shock, there was my husband, humming a little tune while flipping pancakes. I rubbed my eyes. Was I seeing things? Surely I was delusional from lack of sleep. That had to have been it. Then Justin turned, his icy blue eyes locking onto mine. "Morning, princess. I hope you're hungry. I saw you sleeping on the couch, and I thought you might not be feeling well, so I decided to make you a hot meal to help you get better." My heart skipped a beat. Was this really my husband? It looked like him. Sounded like him too. Still, I was weary. Yeah. Just feeling a little under the weather is all. Are you feeling okay? You're acting different." "Never been better. Honestly, I think I've really turned a new leaf," he said, placing a steaming plate before me. "The old Justin is kaput. From now on, I swear, I'm going to be the best husband I can be." Our gazes connected, and I searched his expression for answers. He seemed genuine. If this was an act, it was a damn good one. "Thanks, babe. That really makes me happy to hear." Justin beamed at me, the warmth of his smile seeping into my heart. It had been years since he looked at me like that. "Well, get used to it, because I'm keeping my word. I love you, Lydia." I wanted to be suspicious. I wanted to remain silent. I wanted to keep my guard up, but how could I? All I needed was love and attention, and I was finally getting it. For the first time in a long time, it felt like my husband actually cared. "I love you too, Justin," I muttered before digging into my meal. A big part of me was still leery of my husband. His timing was pretty convenient after all. But even with all my doubts, Justin was seemingly sticking to his promise. He took me out on dates, paid to get my nails done, bought me flowers. He even started shouldering most of the housework. Needless to say, I was impressed. If he would have kept that up, I might have never suspected a thing. But one night, he slipped up. We were cuddled up on the couch watching The Truman Show when I asked. Now I wish I would have kept my mouth shut. "Hey, babe?" "Yes, my love," Justin asked, his eyes still glued to the screen. "If someone close to you was an imposter, like a perfect replica except for a few tiny changes, do you think you'd notice?" Justin tensed up, his eyes wide as he slowly turned to face me. A blank stare had overtaken his expression. A chill rippled through my body when he looked at me like that. He was beginning to frighten me. "I suppose so. Why do you ask?" His voice was monotone, dripping with a tinge of urgency. I didn't know how to process his sudden shift in personality. "It's the premise of the movie we're watching." I watched as the color seeped back into his face, and he loosened up, breathing a sigh of relief. I cocked a curious brow. Why was he acting so strange? That makes sense. We sat there in uncomfortable silence, shifting our attention back to the TV screen. After a few more tense moments, I couldn't take it anymore. "I've got to use the restroom and charge my phone. I'll be right back. No need to pause the movie for me." Justin nodded before grinning up at me. His smile. Had his teeth always been that straight? "Okay, baby girl. Hurry back. Wouldn't want your spot to get cold." "Yeah, sure thing." I practically bolted up the stairs, locking myself in our room. I slumped against the door, trying to steady my palpitating heart. What was going on? Was it just me, or was that some seriously freaky behavior? Either way, I needed a second to calm down. I had my eyes shut, focusing on my breathing when I heard it. My phone was buzzing from inside my pocket. I hurriedly retrieved it, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. I normally don't answer calls from strangers, but something compelled me. Maybe it was intuition, or perhaps I just wanted someone to talk to other than my husband. In the end, I accepted the call. Hello? Lydia? Lydia Atkins? Speaking. "Look, this is going to sound crazy, but I need you to hear what I have to say." Okay? I suddenly jolted up from my spot on the floor and stared at the locked door separating me from the hallway. Loud knocks rattled it in its frame. "Lydia! Lydia, who are you speaking to?" Panic surged through me as I scrambled for an answer. It's my mom. Go back downstairs. I'll be there in a minute." "That was him, wasn't it?" the caller said. "That was my husband, yes. Why do you ask?" I whispered, putting as much distance between myself and the door as possible. "Lydia, I need you to hear me out. Can you promise me that you will?" The pounding on the opposite side of the room grew even louder. "Lydia, don't listen to her. She's a fucking liar." My stomach began to twist itself into knots. How did he know? "I'm listening. I'll hear what you have to say." The woman on the other end of the line breathed an audible sigh of relief. "Okay, my name is Adeline, and Justin and I have been seeing each other for about 9 months. That man in your house is not your husband." My blood turned to ice and I began to tremble. No, that couldn't be true. In a shaky voice, I asked the question that will haunt me until I die. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" There was a long pause, the bangs outside my door reaching a nauseating crescendo. When Adeline answered, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was in serious danger. "Lydia, for the past week, Justin has been living with me." Story 3. I was trapped in a town that shouldn't exist. My name is Daniel, and I'm a trucker. Throughout my job, I've seen my fair share of weird things on the road, but this was the weirdest by far. I was on a delivery trip to a place called Evergrove, which I had never heard of before. My boss said that the path was pretty simple, but the GPS led me down a series of increasingly remote roads. Just when I thought I must have taken a wrong turn, I saw an old, weathered sign that read, "Evergrove, 5 miles." My curiosity piqued, and I decided to follow the sign. The road seemed to narrow and twist, with trees growing so thick they almost seemed to close in around me. As I drove through the town, my surroundings changed in a way that was very confusing. The expansive fields and forests turned into strange, sprawling neighborhoods with buildings that looked modern and ancient at the same time. When I finally reached the outskirts of Evergrove, I realized just how big it really was. It was much bigger than any town had the right to be. Roads stretching onto infinity, and the suburban houses towering above me in a way that wasn't right considering their size. And yet there was no people walking, no faces in the windows. I tried to call my dispatcher. At this point, my heart was racing. My phone had no signal, the only sound around being the humming of my truck. I pulled into a small rest area, hoping to get my bearings. The town's layout seemed to defy logic. Streets looped back on themselves, and landmarks that should have been familiar were nowhere to be found. As I stepped out of the truck, a chill ran down my spine. Everything felt oddly still, as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. I drove through the town, looking for the increasingly elusive delivery address. The streets turned through each other in ways that didn't obey the laws of 3D space. Buildings on one side looked brand new, and on the other, ruins. At last, a street sign, Evergreen Row. Something about it made my heart drop. As I drove closer, it changed. No longer Evergreen Row, it now said Twisted Pine Ave. The more I drove, the more confused I became and the more scared I got. At some point, I saw a massive skyscraper in the distance, only for it to vanish into thin air the second I turned, replaced by a row of quaint, small, old-fashioned houses. The town's scale was immeasurable. It was as if the more I drove, the more town there was, as if it made more of itself, just for me. The buildings and streets seemed to be shifting and reshaping themselves, a phenomenon that made me question my own sanity. As night fell, the town's surreal nature intensified. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. I decided to head back to my truck and try to contact my dispatcher again. The feeling of being watched was palpable, and I noticed a peculiar faint hum resonating through the ground, like the entire town was vibrating at a frequency just out of sync with reality. While navigating a particularly twisted part of the town, I suddenly felt a jarring shift. The road in front of me seemed to ripple, like a mirage, and the surroundings became a blur of impossible angles and colors. I struggled to keep control of the truck as the road appeared to dissolve into an inky void. The sensation was disorienting, as though the fabric of space was unraveling around me. In a moment of panic, I glanced at the dashboard and noticed that the time had stopped, or at least the digital clock was no longer updating. My truck's engine sputtered, and the familiar hum of the motor became a cacophony of distorted sounds. It was as if I was on the edge of some boundary, a precipice between dimensions. As I drove, I felt myself being pulled forward by an invisible force. The surroundings shifted rapidly, and I was unable to control the truck's direction. The road seemed to fold in on itself, creating a tunnel of swirling lights and shadows. Just before I lost consciousness, I saw the entire town collapsing into a vortex of impossible geometry and chaotic energy. The next thing I knew, I was being pulled down out of this confusing town, out through the floor of my truck. The air in my lungs seemed to disappear, and my eyes started to sting. Above me, the inky blackness was pierced by a blinding white. I scooped desperately through the air, water, around me, attempting to claw my way desperately towards the light, the sun. I was running out of air. I was going to die. Ha, I thought. So this is how it ends. This is how I die. Suddenly, I thrust myself out of the inky blackness of the water into warm light and fresh air. As I looked around, treading water, I made a shocking realization. I was lost at sea. In the distance, I saw a boat. I flagged it down with all my might, kicking and yelling at the top of my lungs. Thankfully, the white fishing boat seemed to notice me and seemed to right its course towards me. The fishermen were confused by my story and the state I was in. They pulled me aboard and took me back to shore, but I was sure that I would, thankfully, never find Evergrove again. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear Evergrove was real, and it felt like it was trying to keep me there forever. There were moments when I felt like the town itself was alive, watching me, manipulating my reality. Now, all I have left are fragmented memories and a lingering sense of dread. So here I am, asking if there's anyone out there who's had a similar experience or who can offer any insight into what I went through. I'm hoping that by sharing my story, I might find some answers, or at least some understanding. Thanks for reading, and please, if you've encountered anything like this, let me know. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing for more real-life horror story content. Thank you.